Hey guys, tonight we're shifting our focus to explore what life was really like in a Victorian asylum. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the Victorian Asylum, a place designed not for grand parties in elite surroundings, but for confinement under the guise of treatment. These massive, self-contained institutions operated by their own strict rules, completely separate from the outside world. In the 1800s, if someone was deemed insane or exhibited any kind of problematic behavior, they were often sent to an asylum. This meant that these institutions quickly became filled with people who did unnecessarily have a diagnosable mental illness, but were simply different. Within these walls, some patients could find refuge, while others had their human rights violated every single day. The period between Queen Victoria's accession to the throne in 1837 and her death in 1901 was a time of great change, advancement, and upheaval in Europe and around the world. During this period, many countries experienced rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social change. As society changed so rapidly, so did the way people viewed the world and each other. New ideas and philosophies emerged, challenging traditional ways of thinking and behaving. These changes also affected the way people with mental illness were perceived and treated. During the Victorian era, there was a growing awareness of mental illness and its causes. This led to the establishment of more mental asylums, or hospitals, dedicated to the care and treatment of people with mental illness. These institutions were intended to provide a safe and controlled environment for patients, while also seeking to cure them of their illnesses. But it wasn't always sunshine and roses. As we know, history isn't black and white, and these asylums had their fair share of problems. What were these asylums like? It's important to note that not all Victorian asylums were the same. Each institution had its own unique culture and practices, which varied depending on factors such as location, size, and staff. Despite these differences, however, some common themes and experiences can be found across most Victorian asylums. One of the most striking features of Victorian asylums was their architecture. These buildings were often large and imposing, designed to be clearly identified from a distance, so those who needed help could easily find their way to them. The design of the asylum itself was supposed to promote healing and recovery. Many of these facilities were built in the form of a Greek cross, with each wing dedicated to a different purpose, such as housing patients, providing medical services, or offering recreation areas. This layout was intended to create a sense of order and symmetry, which was believed to be therapeutic for patients. Asylums were typically surrounded by extensive grounds that provided patients with space to roam and engage in outdoor activities. The grounds were often designed to be picturesque and relaxing, with manicured gardens, trees, and even artificial lakes. This was done intentionally to create a peaceful and calming environment that would aid in the healing process. The inside of Victorian asylums were just as carefully designed. The common areas were furnished with comfortable seating and decorated with artwork and plants. This was done to create a welcoming and homely atmosphere that would put patients at ease. In fact, in an effort to make the stay as pleasant as possible, many asylums provided their patients with a wide range of amenities. including libraries, reading rooms, dining halls, and even ballrooms. They might have been insane, but they weren't animals. But not everything was fun games. While it is true that some asylums did provide a high standard of care, this was not always the case. In many instances, patients were subjected to harsh and inhumane treatment. One of the most common forms of mistreatment was physical abuse. This could take the form of beatings, restraint, or even torture. Patients were often restrained using devices such as straitjackets and handcuffs, which were designed to keep them from harming themselves or others. However, the use of these devices could be excessive, and patients were often left in them for extended periods of time. Another common form of mistreatment was neglect. This could include a lack of food, water, or basic medical care. In some cases, patients were left to wander the halls of the asylum without any supervision or assistance. And when it came to medical care, well, things weren't always done with the patient's best interest at heart. Some doctors believed that certain illnesses could be cured through painful procedures such as bloodletting, which involved draining the patient's blood. Others believed that patients could be cured through a process called hydrotherapy, which involved the use of water to treat various mental and physical illnesses. So what did daily life look like in one of these establishments? Well, upon arrival, patients would be stripped of their clothing and belongings and given a gown to wear instead. They would then be assigned to a particular ward based on their diagnosis or symptoms. Male and female patients were typically kept in separate wards, and there were often different wards for patients with different illnesses. For example, there may be a ward for patients with dementia, another for those suffering from depression, and another for those who had committed crimes. Once a patient was assigned to a ward, they would follow a strict daily routine that was designed to maintain order and control. Patients were typically woken up early in the morning and expected to make their beds and tidy their living quarters. They were then given breakfast and may be given a simple task to complete during the day. Lunch and dinner would then be followed by more chores, and the day would end with a curfew. Any patients who were unable to care for themselves would be assisted by nurses or attendants. And life wasn't all work and no play. Patients were sometimes allowed to participate in recreational activities such as gardening, carpentry, or sewing. They may also attend religious services or sing in a choir. Evening activities might include reading or storytelling. In some asylums, patients were even allowed to have visitors during certain hours. However, these visits were carefully monitored, and patients were not allowed to speak to their visitors about their illness or treatment. Now, it's important to point out that not all Victorian asylums were like this. Some were far more progressive in their approach to patient care. For example, some asylums began to use occupational therapy as a means of treating patients. This involved providing patients with meaningful work to do, such as farming, carpentry, or domestic chores, which was believed to help them reintegrate into society upon their release. Other asylums began to experiment with new forms of therapy, such as talking therapy, which involved having patients discuss their thoughts and feelings with a trained professional. These approaches were more humane and focused on the individual needs of each patient rather than simply punishing them for their behavior. As the century drew to a close, however, many asylums were still struggling to provide adequate care for their patients. By 1900, there were over 200 asylums in England alone, housing over 80,000 patients. However, the number of patients was increasing rapidly due to a variety of factors, including a growing awareness of mental illness and the asylum movement. This movement encouraged the confinement of people with mental illness, as well as those who were considered to be morally insane, meaning they were deemed to have engaged in behaviors that were deemed unacceptable by society, such as homosexuality or being an atheist. The overcrowding in asylums meant that many patients were not receiving the care and treatment they needed. In addition, the staff in many asylums were poorly trained and underpaid, which led to a high rate of staff turnover and a decline in the quality of patient care. Despite these challenges, however, some asylums continued to innovate and experiment with new approaches to patient care. By the turn of the century, several asylums had begun to adopt a philosophy known as moral treatment, which emphasized the importance of providing patients with a humane and supportive environment. Moral treatment was based on the belief that mental illness was caused by a lack of moral and social development rather than by any physical defect, and it held that patients could be cured through a combination of education, hard work, and good example. Asylums that adopted this philosophy provided patients with a wide range of activities and opportunities to develop socially and morally. They also staffed their facilities with well-trained and compassionate employees who were committed to the welfare of their patients. What did they do in the Victorian Asylum? Asylums are generally considered to be places of sadness, confinement, restraint, isolation, and neglect. And while these conditions certainly existed in many institutions in the Victorian era, there was also a school of thought that believed in treating the insane with dignity, care, and respect. This more enlightened approach was practiced in one institution above all others, the Victorian Asylum. Come with me now on a quick trip back in time to learn about what it would have been like if you had been admitted to this unique place. The Victorian era in England lasted from 1837 to 1901. During this period, Queen Victoria sat on the throne and the country went through massive changes. Industrialization advanced rapidly, cities became overcrowded, poverty became widespread, and new social problems arose, such as alcoholism, prostitution, and crime. People living during the Victorian era were fascinated by science and technology, and this applied to the treatment of mental illness as well. Doctors began to study the insane with an almost scientific approach, attempting to diagnose the causes and seeking effective treatments. Theories abounded regarding what caused insanity and how to cure it. Some blamed immoral behavior, while others pointed to alcohol or traumatic experiences. Many believed that insanity resulted from an imbalance of the humors, that is, an uneven balance of blood, phlegm, black, and yellow bile. Treatments varied, but could include bloodletting, induced vomiting, and even blistering. These methods were often brutal and sometimes dangerous. During the early days of asylums, patients were often shackled to walls or left in dark cells for long periods. As the century progressed, however, attitudes towards the insane began to change. The French physician Philippe Pinel, who worked at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris, pioneered a more humane approach to treatment. He rejected harsh physical punishments and instead advocated for moral management. His methods included providing patients with comfortable clothing, encouraging them to pursue hobbies, and improving their living quarters. Pinel's ideas spread throughout Europe and America and eventually made their way to England. There they took root in the mind of one man, Dr. Thomas Kirk, superintendent of the newly opened county asylum in Lincoln. The Lincoln County Asylum was opened in 1847 to address the growing need for mental health care in the area. Unlike other asylums of the time, it aimed to implement Pinnell's more progressive theories of moral management. Dr. Kirk took his belief in treating the insane with humanity and understanding to an even higher level. When he assumed control of the asylum, he created what has become known as the most humane asylum in history. One of the first things that anyone would notice upon entering the asylum grounds would be the beautiful gardens surrounding the main building. The gardens were designed not only to be pleasing to the eye, but also to provide a relaxing and therapeutic environment for patients. Patients were encouraged to spend time outdoors, to take walks, and to engage in gardening activities. This was a radical departure from the norm, as most asylums of the time kept patients confined to dark, dank rooms for most of the day. Walking into the main hall of the asylum, visitors would immediately notice that there were no bars on the windows or locked doors. Dr. Kirk believed that this would only serve to remind the patients of their confinement and would contribute to their distress. Instead, each room was equipped with padded walls that were covered in fabric, making it much more difficult for patients to hurt themselves, while still ensuring their safety. This innovation allowed patients to move about the asylum freely and without restriction. While under close supervision, of course, this was another radical idea, as most asylums of the Victorian era kept their patients in strict confinement. Dr. Kirk believed that the key to treating the insane was to make them feel as comfortable as possible. To that end, he made sure that the patients' rooms were clean and well ventilated, and that they had access to plenty of fresh food and water. He also encouraged patients to decorate their rooms with pictures and personal belongings to make them feel more at home. Staff members were trained to treat the patients with kindness and respect. They were encouraged to talk to the patients in a calm and soothing voice and to engage them in conversation about their interests. The goal was to make the patients feel as though they were being treated as human beings rather than simply as insane people. In addition to the comfortable surroundings and respectful staff, Dr. Kirk also provided his patients with plenty of activities to keep them busy and their minds sharp. This included activities such as drawing, painting, sculpting, music, and reading. Dr. Kirk believed that keeping the patients' minds active was essential to their recovery, and he wanted to ensure that they had plenty of opportunities to do so. Perhaps the most important aspect of Dr. Kirk's approach to treatment was his focus on personal attention. He believed that each patient was an individual and that they needed to be treated as such. He encouraged his staff to get to know their patients, to learn about their interests, and to engage them in activities that they enjoyed. This individualized approach was a radical departure from the standard practice of the time, which was to treat all patients in the same way, regardless of their individual needs. So what would it have been like to be a patient at the Victorian Asylum? Well, for starters, you wouldn't have been locked up in a dark room for most of the day. Instead, you would have been able to roam the halls and the grounds of the asylum freely. You would have been able to decorate your room to make it feel more like home, and you would have had plenty of activities to keep you busy. You would have also been treated with kindness and respect by the staff, who would have taken an interest in getting to know you as an individual. Of course, being in an asylum meant that you were still confined to the institution, and that you were unable to live your life outside of its walls. But given the alternatives, which were typically much worse, the Victorian Asylum might have not been such a bad option. Sadly, Dr. Kirk's enlightened approach to treatment was not widely adopted in England or elsewhere. In fact, the Victorian Asylum was eventually closed down, and the patients were transferred to other institutions. Despite its short lifespan, however, the asylum's legacy lived on. The ideas that Dr. Kirk and his staff pioneered in the treatment of mental illness continued to be studied and debated by mental health professionals long after the asylum was closed. And some of their ideas are still used in modern mental health care. Dr. Thomas Kirk's experiment in humane treatment of the insane may have failed to gain traction in his own time, but its impact on the future of mental health care cannot be overstated. He proved that the insane could be treated with dignity, care, and respect, and still make progress toward recovery. His work paved the way for a more enlightened approach to mental health care and ultimately helped to improve the lives of countless individuals who were suffering from mental illness. So what would you have done in the Victorian Asylum? Would you have benefited from the compassionate care and individualized treatment that Dr. Kirk and his staff provided? Or would you have been better off under the more traditional and restrictive regimes of other institutions? Let us know in the comments below. The Victorians were obsessed with death. Funerals, mourning, and cemeteries permeated Victorian culture, but they also revolutionized how we cared for the dead. Today, mortuaries are sterile, clinical spaces where science, not sentimentality, is the guiding principle. But this wasn't always the case. In the mid-19th century, a more humane way of dealing with the dead was emerging in the Victorian era. Asylums and hospitals were taking greater care of those who died under their roofs. And some asylums even began to house the dead in mortuaries that were designed to be beautiful, almost heavenly places. So why did this happen? How did these sanatoriums manage to change public opinion? And what can we learn from their example today? It was the 1830s before the term asylum had become a synonym for creepy, abandoned horror house. In fact, the word asylum initially carried positive connotations. An asylum was meant to be a safe haven or a refuge, a place that would protect those who needed help. But the reality was far from the ideal. In the 18th century, asylums were run by local authorities, meaning each institution was administered differently depending on who was in charge. Some asylums were woefully underfunded and overcrowded. Others were little more than prisons for the insane. Corporal punishment was widespread, and there was little effort made to treat patients with any kind of dignity. By the mid-1800s, the conditions were so bad that a movement to reform asylums sprang up across Europe and North America. Moral treatment, as it was called, involved treating patients like human beings rather than outcasts. This meant providing comfortable rooms, nutritious food, and meaningful activities. For many asylum superintendents, moral treatment was only one piece of the puzzle. They wanted to improve every aspect of life within their walls, including what happened after a patient died. Throughout history, when someone died in a hospital or an asylum, their body would often be dumped in a mass grave. Sometimes the dead went unburied for days. There were several reasons for this. Hospitals were generally seen as a temporary place of safety. When someone came into a hospital, they brought their belongings with them, and when they died, their possessions were taken by their family members, or, if nobody came to claim them, sold at auction or given to the hospital. The corpse itself was often too much of a burden to deal with. Many hospitals didn't have space to store bodies, especially during outbreaks of contagious diseases like cholera. Also, Most hospital staff weren't employed to care for the dead. They were there to care for the living, and they were expected to treat the dead as quickly as possible so that they could focus on their patients. As a result, the dead were frequently denied proper burials. But the Victorians wanted to do things differently. At the time, the ideal of the Victorian lady and gentleman demanded decorum and reserve at all times, even in death. While the wealthy could afford to have their dead embalmed and buried in elaborate coffins, the poor were often left to rot. But some hospitals and asylums were determined to change this. The movement started in 1834, when the London Workhouse opened its first purpose-built mortuary. By the end of the century, most major hospitals and asylums had followed suit. But why? Why go out of their way to care for the dead? Well, it had a lot to do with how people saw the purpose of the asylum. Asylums were originally created to cure the sick, not just to warehouse them. But over the years, many asylums had strayed from this mission. Moral treatment attempted to remedy this problem, but it was a slow process. Patients couldn't be rehabilitated until they were viewed as people first and foremost, and that meant caring for them even after death. Caring for the dead was also a practical consideration. Medical examiners realized that the earlier they examined a body after death, the better. They could diagnose a disease and determine its cause. If families allowed them to, doctors could then study the effects of the illness, track its progression, and look for ways to stop it in its tracks. This was important because many illnesses that struck down the living could also strike down the dead. Typhoid, cholera, and smallpox were particularly common, killing dozens or even hundreds of people every year. The best way to prevent the spread of these diseases was to study them. But without access to the body, medical science was flying blind. Of course, not everyone was on board with the idea of autopsies. Families understandably wanted to bury their loved ones undisturbed, and religious groups argued that tampering with the body desecrated the vessel of the soul. But most people could see the logic in allowing doctors to study a dead body, if it would help keep the living from dying. Eventually, most hospitals and asylums negotiated agreements with local clergy and officials that allowed them to perform autopsies under certain circumstances, and that paved the way for something new. While autopsies were performed behind closed doors, the Victorians wanted to bring that process into the light. That may sound horrifying, but remember that the Victorians had a complicated relationship with death. While they believed that death should be treated with reverence, they were also fascinated by it. Death photography was popular, and novels featuring ghosts and spirits were all the rage. A public autopsy could attract hundreds of spectators, eager to witness death one last time. The show was also educational, not only for the medical students and practitioners in attendance, but for the public as well. It was rare for regular folk to be exposed to medical science, but autopsies were advertised as a chance to learn about the inner workings of the body and the mysteries of death. But the real genius of the public autopsy was that it provided an opportunity for the living to connect with the dead. The Victorians believed that everyone should die with dignity, and public autopsies ensured that that happened. After the procedure, the corpse was washed and prepared before being placed in a coffin. Friends and family were invited to come and pay their respects one last time. Then the coffin was carried out to a waiting hearse, usually surrounded by a funeral procession of staff, patients, and townspeople. Because so many patients died without friends or family to claim their bodies, the staff of the asylum or hospital took it upon themselves to give them a proper send-off. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, and other staff lined the streets to watch the funeral pass by. They might not have been able to give the dead person a proper life, but they could at least ensure that they got a proper death. But there was more to the spectacle than just giving the dead a proper burial. It was also a chance to celebrate their lives. The Victorians had a strong sense of community, and that extended to those who had passed on. Funeral attendees would have known the deceased and would grieve alongside their family. In some cases, they would also celebrate the deceased's life. Religious leaders would talk about good deeds and accomplishments. Then, once the body was lowered into the grave and the mourners had gone home, the staff returned to work with renewed vigor. They knew that their work was important because every patient they cared for would eventually die. But by handling the body with respect, by celebrating the life that had been lived, they could make sure that no one died alone, unloved or forgotten. But it wasn't easy. There were still plenty of people who didn't want autopsies or public funerals, and the staff had to walk a fine line between respecting the dead and advancing medical science. However, despite the challenges, the results were undeniable. Public autopsies became popular, drawing crowds of up to 200 people to watch, and visitors to the hospitals and asylums reported being moved by the reverence shown to the dead. But while this new system worked well in theory, in practice, some of the patients were still getting lost in the shuffle. Not every hospital had the budget or the desire to hold elaborate funerals for every single person who died in their care. And that meant that some people never received the dignified send-off that they deserved. It was until later that innovations like the embalming machine and the electric chair made it easier to transport bodies long distances that the Victorians' dream of a humane death became a reality. So what can we learn from the Victorians? Well, they teach us that while death is inevitable, the way we handle the dead says more about us than them. They also teach us that we can find beauty in death, but we shouldn't shy away from it. The Victorians were fascinated by death, but they were also unafraid of it, and that's something we can all learn from. Death is a part of life, and we should embrace it as such. The year is 1840, and you are a poor farmer living in rural England. Your crops failed this year, and your farm animals all died. Not to mention your wife ran off with the traveling salesman that was just here last week, selling Bible door to door. Life really seems to be beating you down lately, doesn't it? Well, it might be time to check yourself into the asylum. Yes, you heard me right. Asylums were intended to be places of healing for those with mental illness. Unfortunately, asylums soon became dumping grounds for people society didn't want to deal with anymore. Let's get into it. The asylums of the Victorian era were not the first institutions intended to house the mentally ill. However, they were the first institutions that were largely dedicated to the confinement of those diagnosed with mental disorders. Prior to this time, those who exhibited strange behaviors or beliefs were often seen as dangerous and would be chained up in their homes or even put to death. In extreme cases, these individuals were also ostracized from society altogether and left to fend for themselves. While not ideal, these methods of treatment were at least well-intentioned and stemmed from a place of concern for others. Asylums came onto the scene in an attempt to reform these harsh practices. The first purpose-built psychiatric hospital was established in London in 1774, followed by several more throughout the next few decades. These hospitals were run by private physicians who charged patients' families a handsome fee for their services. Because of this, the hospitals had a difficult time turning a profit and caring for their patients. This problem remained until 1828, when French physician Philippe Pinel introduced moral management. This method of treatment advocated for more humane treatment of patients and encouraged them to participate in daily activities that they enjoyed. Unfortunately, this new form of treatment was free, and the poor still couldn't afford treatment unless the government got involved. In 1840, Queen Mary established the County and Town Asylums Act, which provided funding for the construction of public asylums across England and Wales. These hospitals were to be built outside of town, but not too far away that patients could not be visited. And while this law did increase access to health care, it also shifted the way patients were treated. Since the government now funded these facilities, they set up boards of directors to oversee them. Boards consisted of local doctors and magistrates who ensured that the hospitals ran smoothly and were fiscally responsible. However, they also gave administrators of the asylum a lot of leeway on who could be admitted into the facility. And this is where things took a turn for the worse. Administrators of the asylum didn't need a valid mental health diagnosis to commit a patient. In fact, the list of possible diagnoses was quite broad. Doctors could commit anyone who was, quote, incapable of managing themselves or exhibited incipient mental derangement. What this meant is that those who were homeless, chronically intoxicated, epileptic, or even impoverished could be easily locked up without any true diagnosis or appeal. Women who were unwed mothers were also targeted, since they were seen as a danger to society. Even though the child might have been conceived during a moment of duress or rape, the mother was always blamed and held accountable. To make matters worse, once inside the asylum, there was no way out. Patients were confined to these asylums for life, and their families were given no follow-up care instructions or timeline for recovery. Overcrowding was also a major issue within these asylums. At the beginning of the century, only 6,376 beds were available for the mentally ill. By 1890, that number rose to 63,000 beds. But it wasn't the increase in beds that led to overcrowding. Instead, the pool of people being admitted into these asylums expanded to include anyone who was inconvenient for society. Families also began to see these asylums as a place for them to drop off their unwanted family members and collect an allowance for doing so. Some people were even sent to these asylums simply because they were a nuisance to their neighbors. All of this has led to the question, why were these asylums so awful? Like we said before, the initial intent of asylums was to reform the way the mentally ill were treated and cared for. But as the 1800s rolled on, the definition of who needed treatment became muddier. The result was a mass confusion of individuals with legitimate mental health problems, individuals with severe behavioral issues, individuals who were disabled, and individuals who were simply in unfortunate circumstances. This made treating patients incredibly difficult and led to these asylums becoming warehouses for the undesirable rather than hospitals for the sick. But what exactly was life like for these patients? For starters, if you were deemed insane, you would be stripped of your belongings and given a simple cotton nightgown to wear. You would then be photographed while wearing this gown and have your head shaved. This photo would then become part of your permanent record at the institution. Once you were photographed, you would be given a number and called only by that number for the rest of your stay. From that point forward, you would have no rights, and your entire day would be regimented by the staff. Each morning, you would be woken up before sunrise and immediately get to work. Men were expected to perform menial tasks such as scrubbing floors, cleaning walls, and cutting grass. Women were relegated to domestic duties and were forced to sew or do laundry all day. Lunatics were expected to complete quotas of work each day and were punished severely if they were not met. At night, lunatics were locked into their rooms with only a straw mattress and blanket for comfort. They were expected to sleep while lying on their sides to prevent them from choking on their spit. Guards patrolled the halls all night to keep an ear out for any disturbances. If a lunatic was caught screaming or singing at the top of their lungs, they were restrained and given a dose of sedative. Food was also carefully monitored and restricted within the asylums. Breakfast consisted of bread, porridge, and tea. Dinner was typically a meat broth with root vegetables, and leftover portions were given to patients for lunch the following day. The staff rationed the amount of food each patient was given, and any extra food was confiscated. Throughout the day, patients were not allowed to talk to one another and were forbidden from eating any of the food they had brought from home. While life in the asylum was awful for everyone, there were some select groups of people who suffered even greater abuse than others. Women were routinely subjected to sexual harassment from male doctors who would use their positions of power to take advantage of their patients. Homosexuality was also illegal at the time, and homosexual patients were singled out and abused by staff and fellow patients alike. African American patients faced incredible racism from both the staff and other patients and were denied proper treatment because of their race. But there were some good things happening in the world of Victorian medicine, especially in America. In 1854, Dr. Samuel Woodward established the first separate hospital for children and adolescents in the United States, called the Victorian Asylum for the insanity of the New York. This hospital paved the way for future psychiatric hospitals for children and improved the lives of many patients. Throughout the late 1800s, there was growing concern over the horrific conditions found within these asylums. Newspapers began to publish exposes on the inhumane treatment of patients in these asylums. This outrage eventually led to change. Beginning in the 1890s, several state-run institutions began to open that focused solely on the mentally ill. These institutions used modern medical techniques to diagnose and treat their patients, which led to overcrowding and abuse being reduced. Private asylums began to follow suit, but because they were privately run, continued to accept anyone as long as they could pay. Today, we remember the Victorian era for its incredible fashion and rapid industrialization. However, the advancements made in science and medicine cannot be ignored. While the treatment of some illnesses and diseases caused more harm than good, others paved the way for modern practices that we use to this day. Do you know of any other historical medical practices that changed the course of history? Let me know in the comments below. Did you know that in the Victorian era, there were over 400 mental asylums in the United Kingdom alone? Asylums first started out as places for people to receive treatment from mental illness, but soon became a place where those who were deemed a danger to society could be sent away, never to be heard from again. These establishments would often be overcrowded and understaffed, and the patients would receive little to no treatment. The conditions could vary wildly depending on which asylum you were staying at. Some were more relaxed and encouraged socializing, and some were strict with their rules and punishments. Let's take a look at what a day in the life of a Victorian asylum patient might have looked like. It was 6 a.m., and the morning bell had already rung twice. You opened your eyes to the dimly lit room that you shared with 7 other women. Your nightgown was crumpled around you, and the straw mattress you laid on was hard as a rock. The room had been silent since lights out at 9 the previous evening, and now it was alive with activity. One woman was already up and kneeling by her bed, saying a prayer, while another struggled to dress, mumbling to herself. You got up and began the daily routine that had become second nature to you. You washed yourself with cold water from a tin basin, put on the drab gray gown provided to you, and tied your hair back with a black ribbon. There was no point in styling it today, or any other day for that matter. You knew that if you did, it would only get tangled even more. You pulled on your leather shoes, buckled them tightly, and joined the line of women shuffling down the hallway. You were sent to the asylum 2 years ago after having a psychotic episode. You cut all of your hair off and burned most of your possessions, screaming at the top of your lungs for everyone to hear. They found you wandering the streets shortly thereafter and brought you here where you now spent every waking hour. Sometimes you thought about going home. You imagined seeing your mother's kind face and the soft brown eyes of your younger sister. You yearned to feel the warmth of a fire and the security of a roof over your head that was made of glass and steel. But then you remembered why you left home in the first place. You remember how your father had hit you when you refused to marry the man he chose for you. You remembered how the town gossiped about you behind your back, and you knew that if you went back, they wouldn't welcome you with open arms. No, you weren't ready to go back yet, but one day you would return home, not as the broken girl who had run away, but as a new woman, healed and stronger than before. The asylum bell rang again, and you fell into step with the other patients. Breakfast awaited you, but you weren't hungry. It didn't matter anyway, because the breakfast was always the same: bread, porridge, and tea. The food here was bland and boring. It was made in such large quantities that it rarely had any flavor. You ate your breakfast quickly and joined the other patients, filing into the next room. Your day now consisted of several hours of structured activities meant to help you reintegrate into society. The first one was cleaning. For 2 hours each day, you and the other patients would clean floors, empty waste bins, and scrub tables and chairs until they gleamed. At least this part of the day gave you something to do and kept your mind off the 4 walls surrounding you. At noon, it was time for rest. This was the quietest part of your day. After lunch, it was quiet work time. You folded laundry, mended clothes, and sorted buttons. In the evenings, you participated in recreation. You and the other patients would sing songs, recite poetry, or tell stories. Once a week, there was a dance class where you were taught old quadrilles and waltzes. You enjoyed dancing, but you hated how the floor felt rough beneath the soles of your feet, and the coarse cotton of your dress rubbed against your legs. The asylum's routine was comforting in a way. You knew what to expect each day. You knew when you would eat, sleep, and work. You knew when the doctor would make his rounds. The routine gave you some normalcy, and that was a nice feeling. Now, the Victorian era was a time of great advances in medicine, but, unfortunately, psychiatry wasn't one of them. As a patient in a Victorian asylum, you were subjected to a variety of treatments, some more effective than others. The first and most common form of treatment was hydrotherapy. Doctors believed that water could cure anything from depression to schizophrenia. So you spent many a day being splashed, sprayed, and scrubbed with cold water. Then there was electroshock therapy. Doctors would attach metal plates to your temples and pass an electrical current through them. This would cause a brief seizure, which they believed would cure your ailments. Then there was the trephination, also known as the prefrontal lobotomy. This procedure involved drilling a small hole into the skull. Doctors believed that this would release the pressure in your brain that was causing your illness. While some of these treatments were more painful than others, they were all equally ineffective. There were also the doctors. Now, it depended on the asylum which doctors you were assigned to. Some were more compassionate than others. Some actually cared about their patients. But there were also those who saw their patients as nothing more than lab rats. These doctors experimented on their patients, trying new and innovative treatments that often did more harm than good. Regardless of the doctor's intentions, they were all alike in the way that they treated their patients. They never asked you what was wrong. They just diagnosed you and treated you as if you were a child. They spoke to you in a condescending tone and treated you like you were incapable of making your own decisions. You longed to tell them that you were a person with thoughts and feelings, but they never gave you the chance. You finished your last task for the day and walked to the mirror to check your reflection. You hardly recognized the hollow-eyed girl staring back at you. She was thinner now, and her skin was paler than before. You tried to smile at your reflection, but it felt foreign to you. When was the last time you smiled? Before the asylum, before everything changed, you sighed and turned away. It was time for bed. You helped make the straw mattresses comfortable by laying on top of a blanket and tucking it in around you. You tucked the side of the blanket under your chin so that it would keep you warm during the night. The other women were already laying on their beds, some praying, others humming a tune. Soon the room was dark and silent. Only the squeak of the bed as you lay on it filled the space. It was a strange sound, one that you had come to accept as normal. The silence was deafening, and it made your heart pound in your chest. You missed the sound of birds chirping outside your window. You missed the sound of laughter. You missed the sound of your mother's voice. You closed your eyes and hoped that tomorrow would be better than today. As the night wore on, you couldn't help but think about the asylum's routine. Would it change? Would you get more freedom? Would you see a friendly face? Or would it be the same old, same old? Each day passed like the one before, filled with meaningless tasks and pointless chatter. You longed for something different, something exciting. But alas, you were stuck in a rut, and it seemed that there was no escape. One night, you heard commotion coming from the hallway. You sat up in bed and listened intently. Voices were raised, and footsteps pounded against the floor. What was happening out there, you wondered? Was there a fight? Had someone escaped? Curiosity gnawed at you, but you knew that you shouldn't listen in on the staff. Still, you couldn't help but strain to hear what was being said. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Startled, you quickly lay back down and pulled the blanket up to your chin. You peeked out from under it and watched as the figure approached your bed. The year is 1876, and you are a well-to-do Englishman. You have been enjoying a quiet weekend at home with your family, when suddenly, bang, 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 you hear 3 distinct knocks on the door. Who could it be? You open the door to find 3 constables, 2 men and 1 woman, who tell you that they need to speak to your wife. Your wife comes to the door And after some very discreet whispering between the officers, they all go into the drawing room together. You try to make conversation with the officers, but they are curt and to the point. All you can do is sit back and listen as they explain why they are there. Your wife has been declared insane and needs to be taken to the nearest asylum. What? You protest? She is clearly quite upset, but she is not violent and really not dangerous. In fact, you continue, she hasn't really done anything wrong at all. It's just that she talks to herself a lot, seems to see things that aren't there, and has spent the last few weeks filling notebooks with bizarre writings that seem to make no sense. Even still, the officers tell you that doesn't matter. The law is very clear. If she exhibits any signs of insanity, then she must be taken to the nearest mental institution immediately. Really, you don't want to argue with them because you know that the law is on their side. Besides, you've always thought that your wife needed help, but she would never agree to go to a doctor. This might be a blessing in disguise. As they put your wife into the carriage, you ask if she will be all right, and the lead constable tells you that she will receive the best care possible. Actually, that's not true. See, in 1876, the rules were different. The police were allowed to bring anyone they deemed insane to an asylum. They did not need a warrant or even a court order. And while it's nice to think that every asylum provided the best care possible, that was certainly not the case. In fact, many of these institutions were little more than warehouses for the insane, filled to the brim with people who needed help but were never going to get it. Asylum reform had been a hot topic since the mid-19th century. People began to realize that most of these institutions were inhumane and in desperate need of change, but it was a slow process. Money was tight, attitudes were slower to shift, and the number of people requiring treatment was only increasing. Today, we are exploring how far the mental health field had come by 1876, and how much further it still had to go. In the late 1800s, most countries had acknowledged the need for mental asylums. While most of these facilities were certainly lacking, they were at least a step up from the workhouses where people used to be sent. At least now, there was a dedicated place for people suffering from mental illness rather than criminals or beggars. That was a start, but things were still bad. The first problem was that these facilities were typically overcrowded. The number of people needing help far outstripped the number of beds available. This meant that new patients often had to wait in a holding facility until a bed became available. Some stayed there for days or weeks before being accepted. And while this wasn't ideal, it was better than being turned away altogether. The second problem was that not everyone who needed help was willing to accept it. Many people felt that there was a stigma attached to mental asylums, and that if they entered one, they would never be able to return to normal life. This is especially true for wealthy patients who could afford to keep their illnesses a secret. If word got out that a member of the upper class had spent time in an asylum, their reputation would be ruined. As a result, many asylums saw very few rich patients, and those that did often received substandard care. After all, the staff had no incentive to make the stay of someone who could afford to pay for better treatment any more tolerable. The third problem was a lack of funding. Most asylums were run by the state and received little financial support. The staff were overworked and underpaid, and there was little money for new equipment or improved facilities. This led to a vicious cycle of low morale, high staff turnover, and worsening conditions. Despite these problems, there were some notable success stories. In France, For example, asylum reform was a top priority, and several facilities were opened that set the standard for the rest of Europe. One of the most famous was the Hospice de la Roche, which was opened in 1841 and quickly gained a reputation for its innovative treatments. Staff were encouraged to be more humane towards their patients, and new therapies were developed that focused on the underlying causes of mental illness. This was a radical departure from the old asylums, which were typically run like prisons and focused more on punishment than treatment. Across the Channel in England, things were moving more slowly. There was still a long way to go before the country's asylums were up to the standards of their French counterparts, but progress was being made. The government had begun to invest more money in mental health care, and a new law had been passed that gave patients more rights. The Lunacy Act of 1890 was a landmark piece of legislation that aimed to improve the quality of care in England's asylums. It established a new set of regulations that had to be met by all mental health institutions, and it created a new position, the Mental Health Commissioner. The commissioner was responsible for inspecting asylums to ensure that they were meeting the new standards. One of the main goals of the Lunacy Act was to reduce overcrowding in asylums. The law limited the number of patients that could be admitted to an institution based on the amount of space available. It also required that patients be given more individual attention. This was done in an effort to improve the quality of care and to reduce the number of deaths that were occurring in asylums. Another goal of the Lunacy Act was to improve the working conditions for asylum staff. The law mandated that staff be paid a fair wage and that they receive regular training. This was intended to reduce staff turnover and to improve the overall quality of care. While the Lunacy Act was a step in the right direction, it did not solve all of the problems facing England's asylums. Many institutions were still overcrowded and understaffed, and there was still a stigma attached to seeking mental health treatment. However, the law did help to raise public awareness of mental illness, and it paved the way for further reforms in the early 20th century. Now let's head back to our story. After much soul-searching, your wife has decided to enter the asylum voluntarily. You are to meet her at the main gate tomorrow morning and say your goodbyes before she is admitted. As you get ready for bed, you can't help but feel like you failed your wife somehow. You wonder what the future holds for her and whether or not she will ever make a full recovery. As the sun rises, you get dressed and head down to the dining room for breakfast. You eat mechanically, unable to focus on anything else but the task ahead. After breakfast, you grab an umbrella and head out the front door. You walk down the street and hail a cab, giving the driver the address of the local asylum. As the cab pulls away, you look back at the house one last time before turning away and walking toward the asylum gates. You reach the gates just as the sun is rising. You take a deep breath and walk through. Inside, you find yourself in a large courtyard, surrounded by trees and shrubs. In the center of the courtyard is a fountain and a statue of a man you assume to be the asylum founder. You hear the sound of children playing in the distance and see a group of patients gardening. You feel a sense of calm wash over you and realize that this place may be what your wife needs. Suddenly, a woman approaches you. She introduces herself as the asylum director and asks you to follow her. She leads you to a building at the end of the courtyard and opens the door. You step inside and are met with the sight of a bustling reception area. There are chairs and couches for visitors and their families to sit on. A fireplace crackles in the corner of the room. Everything is neat and orderly. The director smiles warmly at you and says, "Please have a seat. I'll be right back." She disappears through a door behind a desk. After a few minutes, the director returns with your wife. She looks different, almost unrecognizable. Her hair is pulled back tightly, and she wears a plain white dress. She looks nervous and avoids eye contact with you. The director speaks up, saying, "It's time for you both to say your goodbyes." You stand up and approach your wife. You wrap her in a tight hug and whisper, "I love you," in her ear. She tenses up at first, but then relaxes and hugs you back. "I know," she whispers back. "I love you too." The director clears her throat awkwardly and says, "Well, it's time." You reluctantly pull away from your wife and take a step back. You look at her one last time and then turn and walk away. Asylums during the Victorian era were not always the nicest places. Even though there were well-intentioned people working within them, they still held on to some pretty strong stigmas. For example, if you had a family member who was too much of a handful, or you had an employee who was costing more than they were worth, they could easily be labeled as unwanted and sent off to one of these asylums, never to be heard from again. So today, we recounting down the top 10 most secretive Victorian asylums, where the patients were hidden away and forgotten. Let's get into it. Number 10, The Retreat. Located just outside of York, in the north of England, is the now abandoned Danebank House, which was once known as The Retreat. The Retreat was originally set up by Quakers in 1796, which made it one of the first purpose-built psychiatric hospitals in the world. But this wasn't your average mental hospital. It took a more hands-off approach to treatment, with patients mostly being left to their own devices and the staff mainly looking after the cleanliness of the building. As the years went on, the hospital expanded rapidly, adding more and more buildings to house the ever-growing number of patients. And it seemed like this would continue on forever. A sad end to such a pioneering establishment. No. 9. Carlisle House. Situated at the bottom of a valley surrounded by trees is Carlisle House, which was once the largest psychiatric hospital in the Durham region. Built in 1853, the hospital quickly became overcrowded and understaffed, leading to extremely poor living conditions. It didn't help that many of the patients were kept in padded cells, meaning that when they did get let out, during the First World War, a large section of the hospital was taken over to treat shell-shocked soldiers. This put even more strain on the already overworked staff, as well as gave them access to experimental and rather inhumane treatments, including insulin shock therapy. Eventually, the hospital couldn't keep up with the demand and closed in 1993. But surprisingly, the site hasn't seen any redevelopment since and remains empty to this day. No. 8. The County Asylum. Now known as the Hillside, this imposing-looking building was once the County Asylum, which opened its doors in 1814. Overcrowding was a big issue in this asylum, with critics stating that the patients were packed in so tightly that they hardly had enough room to turn around in. Because of this, a second building was opened across town in 1866, but sadly, both buildings followed the same path and were shut down in 1998 after reports of mistreatment. What makes this closure especially sad is that the two buildings were only a short distance away from each other. Yet patients were transported between them by horse-drawn carts, sometimes taking up to an hour to complete the journey. Can you imagine? Number 7. Rampon Psychiatric Hospital. Tucked away in the mountains of northern Italy lies the eerie Rampon Psychiatric Hospital, which was built in 1881 and operated all the way up until 2013. The hospital was notorious for its harsh treatment of patients, with some even claiming that they were forced to sleep while standing. But no story is more terrifying than that of a missing patient named Teresita Fornari. In 1978, she gave birth to a baby girl while at the hospital and claimed that her child had been kidnapped. Staff searched everywhere for the baby, but couldn't find a trace of her anywhere. Teresita continued to claim that her daughter was alive until her own death in 1987. All of this came to a screeching halt in 2005 when a journalist discovered the truth. Apparently, the baby hadn't been kidnapped. Instead, the hospital had covertly lobotomized her, and she'd been living in a care home ever since. Number 6. Melton House. Perched on a hill overlooking Leicester is Melton House, an imposing red brick building with a dark history. The building itself dates all the way back to 1827, initially operating as a private school for young boys. However, this didn't last long, as it was soon converted into a lunatic asylum. The asylum quickly gained a reputation for its progressive views on treating mental illness, with patients being encouraged to take part in occupational therapy. But despite these positive developments, the asylum saw its fair share of tragedy, including multiple deaths from fires and disease outbreaks. Eventually, it was shut down in 1998 due to declining mental health, and now the building stands empty, with its future uncertain. No. 5. Cane Hill Asylum. Hidden away in the English countryside is the abandoned Cane Hill Asylum, which was built in 1891 to treat the growing number of mental patients in the area. Designed in the shape of a crescent, the building was state-of-the-art when it opened, with patients being housed in small wards with plenty of natural light. Unfortunately, this didn't last long, as the asylum quickly became overcrowded and understaffed. By the 1950s, the asylum had a reputation for being underfunded and badly managed, leading to its eventual closure in 1998. Since then, the site has been left abandoned, with the derelict buildings slowly falling apart. Number 4. Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. Tucked away in the suburbs of London is the former Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, which opened its doors in 1874. Despite its imposing appearance, the asylum actually prided itself on its progressive views on mental health care. Patients were encouraged to take part in occupational therapy and the arts, with some even performing in the asylum's own theater. But despite these efforts, the site is home to a mixture of housing and commercial properties, with very little trace of its former inhabitants. No. 3. The Retreat. Perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the River Ouse in Yorkshire is the imposing building known as the Retreat. Originally established in 1812 as a private mental asylum, the Retreat quickly gained a reputation for its innovative treatment methods. The asylum's founder, Dr. John Connolly, believed that patients should be treated with kindness and respect, and that they could be rehabilitated through hard work and discipline. However, as the years went on, the asylum's fortunes declined, and it was eventually taken over by the local council. In 1998, the Retreat finally closed its doors, and today the building is used as a hotel and conference center. Number 2. Glapthorne Mental Hospital. Sitting on the outskirts of a village in Northamptonshire is the former Glapthorne Mental Hospital, which was established in 1862 to treat the growing number of mentally ill in the county. The hospital was designed in the style of a country estate, with manicured gardens and plenty of space for patients to roam. However, this idyllic setting hid a darker reality. Inside the hospital, patients were subjected to harsh punishments and experimental treatments. One of the most infamous was insulin shock therapy, which involved injecting patients with large doses of insulin to induce a coma-like state. Ultimately, the hospital's reputation was tarnished by its mistreatment of patients, and it was eventually shut down in 1997. Today, the site is home to a mixture of housing and commercial properties, with very little trace of its former inhabitants. And coming in at No. 1 today is Danebank House. Back to Yorkshire we go for today's No. 1 spot, which is held by Danebank House. Originally built in 1839 as a private asylum, Danebank House was designed in the style of a country house, with plenty of room for patients to wander. However, this tranquil setting belied the harsh reality of life inside. Patients were subjected to isolation and restraint, and the staff were often underpaid and overworked. Despite this, Danebank House was one of the first asylums to introduce occupational therapy and the arts as forms of treatment. But these progressive methods weren't enough to save the asylum from closure in 1997. Today, the building is a ruin, with only a handful of derelict buildings remaining. If someone were to ask you what you thought of when you heard the word Victorian, what would you say? Others might think of the Industrial Revolution that brought massive technological advances, but also horrible living conditions. But most will think of the fashion, tight dresses with even tighter corsets, ruffled shirts, and waistcoats with top hats and monocles. They are truly iconic. Today we'll be focusing on that last bit. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to live in the time of Queen Victoria, then imagine this. It's the year 1888, and you've just moved to London with dreams of making it big. You find yourself smack dab in the middle of the Victorian era, known not only for its groundbreaking scientific discoveries and vast industrial growth, but also for its unbearably stuffy social rules. To avoid looking like an uncultured oaf, you need to know the unspoken rules of the Victorian elite. From avoiding topics of discussion to table manners, here's one rule for each letter of the alphabet. A is for alcohol. Alcohol was commonly consumed by all classes of people during the Victorian era. When women did drink, they were expected to do so in private or at home. In public, it was men's business. Cheers. B is for baptism. Children were expected to be baptized shortly after birth, and this was often done during the first Sunday after birth. Godfather and godmother were expected to sign the child's baptism certificate, and if you refused to have your child baptized, you were judged heavily by society, no matter your reason why. If you were a parent during the Victorian era, your children were expected to be seen and not heard. Children were expected to behave properly in public and were often chastised if they were too loud or unruly. This meant no tantrums or bad behavior, and they should always be dressed appropriately for the occasion. A child's clothing reflected their parents' social status, and ill-dressed children were seen as a reflection poorly on their parents. It was also critical to teach children the rules of etiquette from an early age, so they could navigate society successfully. Parents were also expected to arrange for their children to receive a good education. This was particularly important for boys who were expected to attend university and pursue a career. For girls, they were generally educated at home by a governess. Marrying well was also critical for a girl's future, and mothers were expected to begin looking for suitable matches for their daughters as soon as they reached a marriageable age, typically around 18. D is for display of affection. During the Victorian era, there were strict rules regarding the display of affection. Public displays of affection, such as kissing or hugging, were frowned upon and generally avoided. There was a general feeling that such displays were inappropriate and should be reserved for the privacy of one's own home. This applied to all social classes, although the rules were more relaxed for the lower classes. Additionally, there were specific rules regarding the type of affection that was appropriate. For example, it was considered proper for a woman to place her hand on the arm of a man she was acquainted with, but it was considered highly inappropriate for her to touch his face or neck. Men were also expected to be careful in their behavior around women and to avoid any actions that could be construed as overly familiar. E is for eating. As mentioned earlier, food was served on different plates for each course of the meal, and each plate had its own special name. Soup was served in a tureen, which was a large bowl-shaped container with a lid. Fish was served on a platter, which was a large, usually ornamental dish used for serving meat or fish dishes. A pie was served in a pie dish, which was a deep, usually round dish with a raised edge. Game and poultry were served on a trencher, which was a wooden board or platter used for serving meat or poultry. Finally, sweetmeats or desserts were served on a dessert plate or in a dessert bowl. F is for fan. The handheld fan was an essential accessory for any well-bred Victorian lady. Not only did it serve to cool her in hot weather, but it was also an important tool for communicating with other people, particular gentlemen, by fanning herself slowly and delicately when he was present. She could also use her fan to indicate that she was bored or disapproving of the conversation by fanning herself quickly or with a jerk of the wrist. A closed fan could indicate that a lady wished to end a conversation, while a fan held in front of the face indicated shyness or embarrassment. G is for gloves. Gloves were an essential part of a gentleman's attire during the Victorian era. Gloves were made from a variety of materials, including leather, doeskin, and suede, and the quality of the material indicated the wearer's social class. Gentlemen were expected to wear gloves while dining, attending social events, and when meeting or greeting others. Gloves were also used as a symbol of respect. It was customary for a gentleman to remove his gloves when shaking hands with someone. H is for hats. Hats were an essential part of a gentleman's attire during the Victorian era. There was a specific hat for every occasion. A bowler hat was worn for everyday wear. A fedora was worn for travel, and a newsboy cap was worn when engaging in sporting activities. Gentlemen were expected to tip their hats to women as a gesture of respect. It was also customary for a gentleman to remove his hat when entering a house or before speaking to a lady. I is for invitations. If you were invited to a party, wedding, or other social event during the Victorian era, you were expected to respond to the invitation in writing. Even if you couldn't attend, it was critical to decline the invitation properly. A lady's refusal to an offer of marriage had to be done in person and in writing. No phone calls or text messages back then. J is for jewels. Jewelry was an important part of a lady's attire during the Victorian era. Not only did it serve as a symbol of wealth and status, but it was also an important part of her evening attire. Diamonds were the most popular gemstone, followed by pearls and rubies. A lady was expected to wear jewelry when attending social events, and was often given jewelry as a gift by her suitor. The value of the jewelry indicated the status of the suitor. K is for kissing. As mentioned earlier, Kissing was not common in public, but a light kiss on the hand was acceptable between people who knew each other. However, a kiss on the cheek was seen as immodest and only acceptable between close family members. A kiss on the mouth was even more scandalous and was generally avoided in all but the most intimate of circumstances. There were certain topics that were considered taboo during the Victorian era, and it was improper to discuss these subjects in polite company. Sex, religion, and politics were all off-limits. Additionally, it was also seen as rude to speak too freely or to use vulgar or profane language. Speaking in this way was seen as a sign of low social status and was generally avoided by those who wanted to be considered refined. Victorians took great pride in their language and often used long, flowery phrases when speaking or writing. If you were unfortunate enough to lose a loved one during the Victorian era, you were expected to mourn them for a specific period of time. The length of the mourning period depended on the relationship between the mourner and the deceased. For example, a widow was expected to mourn for 2 years after the death of her husband. During the mourning period, you were expected to dress in black and to avoid all social events. You may also have been required to wear a veil or a special head covering. Mourning rituals were an important part of Victorian culture and were seen as a way of showing respect for the dead. N is for napkins. Napkins were not commonly used during the Victorian era. Instead, a piece of bread was used as a napkin. This was placed on the lap to catch any spills and was also used to wipe one's hands after a meal. O is for opera. Opera was extremely popular during the Victorian era, and attending an opera was considered a must for any member of the elite. There were strict rules for what one could wear to the opera and what one could and could not do while the performance was taking place. Ladies were expected to wear long, elegant gowns, and gentlemen were expected to wear their finest suits. Both were expected to behave properly and to refrain from talking or making any noise during the performance. P is for perfume. Perfume was very popular among the elite during the Victorian era, and it was considered a sign of good breeding to wear a subtle scent. However, it was also seen as crass to wear too much perfume, and one had to be careful not to overdo it. The most popular scents were floral or fruity, and it was generally considered improper to wear anything too musky or animalistic. Q is for Queen Victoria. As the namesake of the era, Queen Victoria loomed large over the culture and society of the time. Her Majesty was very involved in the day-to-day running of the empire, and her influence was felt in every corner of Victorian life. The royal family set the trends in fashion, and the courts in London were the place to be seen. R is for reading. Reading was an important pastime during the Victorian era, and it was considered proper for a lady to be seen reading a book or a magazine. However, there were certain books that were considered too scandalous or inappropriate for ladies to read. These included books on sex, politics, or religion. A lady's choice of reading material was often a topic of gossip among the elite. S is for seating. There were strict rules regarding seating during the Victorian era, particularly for women. At a party or social event, women were expected to sit in a particular formation, with the most eligible single women seated closest to the host. Married women were expected to sit further away. At the dinner table, women were not allowed to sit at the head of the table, and it was considered improper for them to eat with men. T is for table manners. Table manners were extremely important during the Victorian era, and it was expected that all members of the elite would know proper etiquette. This included using the correct utensils, not talking with one's mouth full, and avoiding any loud or boisterous behavior. Good table manners were a sign of refinement and were considered essential for any member of the upper class. U is for umbrellas. Umbrellas were an essential accessory during the Victorian era, and both men and women were expected to carry one. They were used not only for protection from the rain, but also as a way of shielding oneself from the sun. It was considered improper to share an umbrella with someone of the opposite sex, and gentlemen were expected to carry their umbrella in their left hand when they were with a lady. V is for visiting. If you were a member of the elite during the Victorian era, you were expected to make regular visits to other members of society. These visits were not necessarily social calls, but were often made to show off one's new fashions or to simply be seen. There were strict rules regarding the length of a visit, and it was considered rude to stay too long or too short. W is for whitelist. During the Victorian era, a whitelist was a list of approved topics for conversation. This was especially important for women, who were expected to be knowledgeable on a variety of subjects. The most common topics on a whitelist were literature, art, music, and current events. Women were also expected to be well versed in the latest fashions and to be able to discuss them with other members of society. X is for X-rays. Although they were seen as a miracle of modern science, there were also fears that they were dangerous and could cause cancer. As a result, the use of X-rays was restricted, and many doctors and scientists were hesitant to use them. Y is for youth. Youth was highly valued during the Victorian era, and it was considered a time of beauty and innocence. This was especially true for young women, who were often seen as the epitome of femininity and grace, and it was common for them to be judged harshly if they did not conform to these standards. C is for zebras. Zebras were all the rage during the Victorian era, and they were often featured in paintings, photographs, and other works of art. Their distinctive stripes were seen as a symbol of exotic Africa and were often used to add a touch of the exotic to a room. Zebra-patterned wallpaper and fabric during the time period. Tonight's historical parenting tip comes from the Victorian era. If you have children, put them in your bed. And by children, I mean lots of children. You may think this is gross or weird or wrong, but to Victorians, this was perfectly normal. Now, if you were one of the elite, it wasn't unusual for a family to share a bed, sometimes up to 8 people. It wasn't just commoners who did this. Queen Victoria herself slept in a huge bed with her husband, Prince Albert, and at least 4 of their 9 children. This was the custom of the time, and although we might think it's bizarre now, there are actually really good reasons behind it. The first reason is that the concept of privacy was not what it is today. For example, Queen Victoria didn't have a separate bedroom from Prince Albert when they were courting. Instead, they had a sort of divider placed in the middle of the bed they shared, so that they could sleep while still being apart. They would also often hold court in this bed while lounging about, and having no doors on bedrooms was very common. Servants would simply walk right in on you. So having a big bed with lots of people sleeping together wasn't all that strange. It was just normal life. Another reason why sharing a bed was normal was because it was cheap. It cost a lot to heat a house in the winter, so many families would simply huddle together for warmth. In fact, one of Queen Victoria's maids wrote of how she would often have to climb into the royal family's bed just to warm up. Another reason was that it was seen as a way of strengthening family bonds. The idea was that sleeping together meant that family members would be closer to each other, literally, and therefore they would be closer emotionally. Also, it kept children safe. Putting kids in bed with adults was a way of making sure that they wouldn't wander off and get lost or kidnapped. Children were often put in the middle of the bed as well, so that the parents could keep an eye on them. And finally, it's worth remembering that childhood was viewed differently during the Victorian era. Children were seen as little adults, and many of them worked within the household from a young age. Many daughters were expected to become wives and mothers themselves one day, and many sons were groomed to take over the family business. So it made sense to put children to bed with adults, since they would be learning about adult life by simply observing what went on around them. They were also expected to behave like adults. When Queen Victoria's children got too old for the family bed, they simply moved to a single bed in the same room as her. They would then stay there until they got married, and even then, they would often come back to this bed when visiting their parents. However, things weren't always so rosy. Sometimes children were banned from the parental bed if they were noisy or had bad manners. On particularly cold nights, servants might also be asked to join the family bed for warmth. This was seen as an honor, and servants were often flattered to be asked, though sometimes they might be asked to sneak into the bed in the middle of the night so as to not disrupt the family. One footman wrote of his duties: "When the family was in bed, I had to get in and take the place between the two children next, the middle, and remain there all night. It was rather a cozy bed and very warm. We had to be very careful, however, not to make any noise, for if the Queen turned over, it was sure to wake the children, which would make a great deal of noise." Now, there is some evidence that Queen Victoria's infamous back problems were worsened by all of the people sleeping in her bed. But she loved the idea of the whole family being close, and it's likely that she would have pushed her doctors to find other causes for her pain. In fact, it seems that the more people in the bed, the better her mood. When her husband died, she reportedly said, "I must now get into my large bed and try and fill the vacant space." Sleeping arrangements in the Victorian era were often dictated by class and gender roles. While the wealthy could afford separate beds, most working-class families would have multiple people sleeping in the same bed. And as the century progressed, new technologies such as indoor plumbing and central heating made it easier for families to have separate bedrooms. But even then, it was still common for children to share a bed with one or both parents. This was especially true in the United States, where large families were common and resources were often limited. For example, in the 1850s, it was reported that a typical working-class family in New York City would have a father, mother, and 6 children sleeping in one bed. However, as cities grew and became wealthier, it became more common for families to have separate bedrooms. By the turn of the century, it was becoming more acceptable for children to sleep alone or with only one parent. In the early 20th century, the invention of the safety pin and the crib further reduced the number of people sharing a bed. The safety pin allowed for easier and more secure clothing for babies and toddlers, meaning that they could be left unsupervised in a crib without the risk of them harming themselves. The crib also provided a safer sleeping environment, as it was made of sturdy materials and had a mattress that fit snugly, reducing the risk of the child falling out. And by the 1930s, it was becoming more common for children to have their own bedrooms and for parents to sleep in a separate bed together. This trend was driven by a number of factors, including changing gender roles, increased prosperity, and the rise of the nuclear family. As women entered the workforce in greater numbers, they had less time to devote to domestic duties and childcare, leading to a more egalitarian division of labor within the household. Increased prosperity meant that families had more disposable income and could afford to pay for domestic help, allowing them to focus on other aspects of their lives. Finally, the rise of the nuclear family, which consisted of a married couple and their children, led to a greater emphasis on the importance of the parent-child relationship and a decline in multi-generational households. Today, it's extremely rare for children to share a bed with their parents, and if they do, it's usually only for a short period of time until the child is old enough to sleep on their own. There are still some cultures where this is common, but in general, it's becoming less and less frequent. What would you do if your father married off your best friend without asking you first? How about if he did it to you? The year is 1889, and London society is in an uproar. Lord and Lady Ashley have done the unthinkable. They married off their 17-year-old daughter, Gertrude, to the Earl of Glenmore without asking anyone else's permission. It's not that the Glenmore wasn't a good match. He was a duke, for heaven's sake, and a wealthy one at that. But he was also 32 years old, with a taste for smoking cigars and driving his motor car while drinking his specially concocted driving. Brandy Kirshen was practically a child. Her mother had died when she was just 14, and her father had been determined to shield her from the harsh realities of the world ever since. So much so that no one outside the household knew that she existed. Until now, the Duke of Glenmore was one of the few men who had been permitted to call upon Lord and Lady Ashley, and he'd fallen madly in love with Gertrude. But even he had been shocked by the speed of the engagement. One can only imagine what the poor girl's father had been up to all these years to have raised such a sheltered daughter. What kind of secrets were they hiding behind those closed doors? Secrets that, if revealed, could destroy not only their social standing, but their very survival. Have you ever wondered what went on behind the drawing room doors of Victorian England? What were the rules of flirting? How did couples actually meet? And what exactly did those curious little cards handed out at parties mean? Well, today we're pulling back the curtains and exposing the underbelly of Victorian marriage. Join me and let's get started. In Victorian England, marriage was more than just a union between two people in love. It was a social contract between families, a transaction of wealth and status. For the upper classes, it was crucial to maintain their social standing, and this was most effectively done through strategic marriages. Marrying within one's own class was the norm, and finding the right match for one's daughter was a mother's primary goal. Fathers were expected to provide for their daughters until they wed, and then they were expected to choose a suitable husband for her. If possible, they would find someone of equal or higher status who would ensure their daughter's financial security. But why leave it to chance? Enter the undercover marriage market. It was a clandestine world where eligible bachelors and bachelorettes were secretly vetted and approved for marriage. Mothers would send their daughters to finishing schools in the hope of attracting a good match. These schools were essentially finishing schools for marriage, where girls were taught the arts of femininity and domesticity with the ultimate goal of securing a profitable union. Once deemed worthy, these young women would be presented at court to meet potential suitors. But do unthink for a second that this was anything like the modern debutante balls of our day. There was nothing debutante about this presentation. No, this was a highly orchestrated affair, almost like a job interview. Each lady was accompanied by her mother, who would stand close by during the presentation, ready to intervene at the drop of a hat. It was an extremely competitive environment, and mothers were known to be ruthless in their pursuit of a good match for their daughters. Gossiping about other people's children was not only acceptable, it was encouraged. And if a girl was deemed too old to marry, well, she was simply ignored. But what if you were a man? How did you enter the marriage market? You had to make your intentions clear, and that meant making your wealth public knowledge. How do you do that? You throw a hell of a party. Throwing parties was the equivalent of putting up a billboard that screamed, "Hey world, I'm rich and I'm looking to marry." It was a necessity for any man who wanted to attract a wealthy bride. And let's face it, who didn't want a wealthy bride? Imagine throwing a party so extravagant that people would talk about it for weeks. Men of means would hire entire orchestras to play at their parties, often spending upwards of £300 per night. That's the equivalent of over £10,000 today. And who wouldn't be impressed by that? The flashier and grander the party, the better the chances of attracting a wealthy bride. After all, you want to be the talk of the town for all the right reasons, don't you? But parties weren't the only way to attract a bride. There was also the art of calling cards. Calling cards were basically the Victorian version of business cards. When a gentleman wished to visit a lady, he would send her a card announcing his arrival. And this wasn't just a formality. Oh no, it was a carefully choreographed dance of etiquette and status. You see, the size of the card itself was a statement. A larger card implied greater wealth, while the quality of the paper and the type of ink used also conveyed a message. Even the wording on the card was carefully chosen. A simple "Mr. Smith desires the pleasure of Mrs. Jones's company" was perfectly acceptable. But if Mr. Smith was feeling particularly bold, he might add "at home" after Mrs. Jones's name, indicating that he was not only seeking her company, but also hoping for her to entertain him in the comforts of her own home. Talk about forward. But what if you weren't interested in playing the game? What if you preferred to keep your private life, well, private? But that was a luxury most people couldn't afford, especially if you were famous. Famous people in the Victorian era had no privacy, none. If you were an actor, a scientist, an artist, or even a politician, the public was entitled to know every little detail of your life. And how did they get that information? Through the press, of course. Newspapers and magazines were filled with gossip about the personal lives of celebrities, and it was considered perfectly acceptable, even encouraged. Privacy was seen as a sign of guilt, and the press was always on the lookout for the next juicy scandal. So if you were famous and single, you either had to play along or risk being labeled as secretive, and perhaps even a little mad. And then there were the rules of flirting. These were the unspoken guidelines that governed how men and women interacted before marriage, and they were as rigid as the corsets worn by the ladies of the time. Men were expected to be attentive and chivalrous, while women were supposed to be coy and demure. But these roles were not just about being nice, they were about power. Men who broke the rules were seen as uncouth and immoral, while women who did the same were labeled as fast and loose. But everyone knew that these rules were just that, rules. Everyone played the game. People flirted, had secret affairs, and broke hearts left and right. Just remember, if you did it right, no one would ever know. Being an independent woman in the Victorian era was seen as scandalous, something akin to having a pet in the parlor. Unthinkable. Women were expected to be sweet and submissive, like the perfect little lamb. And if they showed any signs of independence, well, they were labeled as a shrew. But some women defied these expectations and became famous for their unconventional behavior. Take, for example, the actress Helen Fawcett. She was a trailblazer who refused to play the demure leading lady and instead forged her own path in a male-dominated industry. Or how about the writer George Eliot? She published novels under a male pseudonym because she knew that readers would untake a book seriously if it was written by a woman. But despite the challenges they faced, these women paved the way for future generations of feminists. In 19th century Britain, if someone accused you of stealing a watch, you had two options. You could either take them to court or challenge them to a duel. This was the age of the Victorian elite, and to be a member of this class meant that you had to protect your honor. For the upper classes in Victorian England, their reputation was everything. In fact, it's even rumored that Queen Victoria herself would go into a rage if her appearance was criticized in any way. But while dueling was commonplace among the higher-ups of the British Empire, these duels were often fought by proxy, with seconds taking the place of the gentlemen involved. So what happened when the seconds got a little too enthusiastic during a particularly heated match? Well, let's find out. When it came to fighting, there were few things more important than one's reputation. And as such, it was expected that people should fight to defend themselves against accusations and attacks. However, for the upper classes, it was considered uncouth to fight back against commoners. After all, it would undo for the social order to be disrupted because some aristocrat threw a punch at a servant. So instead, they'd challenge them to a duel. But who could declare a duel? Only those of good standing in society, of course. Commoners were forbidden from participating in duels, and so if a gentleman felt that he had been wronged, he would have to ask another man of standing to declare the duel on his behalf. These men were known as seconds, and they were generally friends of the gentleman they were representing. The Code of Honor was an unwritten set of rules that governed the behavior of the Victorian elite. It dictated that all members of the upper classes must always be ready to defend themselves against any accusation or insult, no matter how false or malicious. And so if someone was accused of doing something wrong, they were expected to challenge the accuser to a duel. This particular duel took place in London in 1862, and it pitted the artist George Cruikshank against the nobleman Lord Frederick Cavendish. Now, we don't know exactly what caused the fight, but it probably had something to do with an insult. In fact, it was reported that Cavendish had challenged Cruikshank to a duel over a cartoon that appeared in Punch magazine. And this cartoon depicted Cavendish's wife and sister-in-law in an unflattering light. However, Cavendish was not a man to be trifled with. He was the son of the Duke of Devonshire, which made him one of the most powerful men in Britain. So when he sent his friend, Colonel William Woodhouse, to challenge Cruikshank, the artist knew that he was in trouble, and so he accepted the challenge. Now, according to the Code of Honor, each duelist would select a second to represent them in the actual fight. And so Cruithoff chose John McNee, and Cavendish chose Captain Mansell. The four men met in Hyde Park to settle the score, and they selected a spot near some trees so that they would have plenty of privacy. Now, we don't know exactly how the fight started, but it didn't last very long. According to reports, one of the seconds landed a lucky blow that knocked Cavendish's man clean out. And so the other 2 seconds continued the fight without them. That is, until the artist's second was also knocked unconscious. And so the fight moved on to the principals, Cruikshank and Cavendish. Now, we don't know who landed the first blow, but we do know that both men were badly hurt. One report says that Cruikshank was cut over the eye and that both of his seconds were knocked out cold. But another report claims that Cavendish was the one who was cut, that he fell down, and that this caused his cane to fall from his hand. Either way, the fight was soon broken up, and the men were pulled away from each other. The 2 seconds who had come to represent the artists in the fight were taken to a nearby tavern to recover, and eventually they were joined by their principals, who were both badly beaten. We don't know who won the fight, but we do know that both men were badly beaten. So why did they do it? Why put themselves through all of that pain and suffering just to defend their honor? Well, it's simple, because they had no other choice. In Victorian England, it was considered shameful to back down from a challenge, no matter how dangerous it was. In fact, it was expected that every member of the upper classes would always be ready to defend themselves against any accusation or insult, no matter how false or malicious. And so if someone was accused of doing something wrong, they were expected to challenge the accuser to a duel. Of course, this meant that people were often fighting over things that weren't even worth fighting about. But that didn't matter. The point was to defend one's honor. In the case of Cruikshank and Cavendish, the fight was over a cartoon that had insulted the latter's wife. Now, we don't know exactly what caused the fight, but it probably had something to do with an insult. In fact, it was reported that Cavendish had challenged Cruikshank to a duel over a cartoon that appeared in Punch magazine. And this cartoon depicted Cavendish's wife and sister-in-law in an unflattering light. However, Cavendish was not a man to be trifled with. He was the son of the Duke of Devonshire, which made him one of the most powerful men in Britain. So when he sent his friend, Colonel William Woodhouse, to challenge Cruikshank, the artist knew that he was in trouble, and so he accepted the challenge. Now, according to the Code of Honor, each duelist would select a second to represent them in the actual fight. And so Cruithoff chose John McNee, and Cavendish chose Captain Mansell. The 4 men met in Hyde Park to settle the score, and they selected a spot near some trees so that they would have plenty of privacy. Now, we don't know exactly how the fight started, but it didn't last very long. According to reports, one of the seconds landed a lucky blow that knocked Cavendish's man clean out, and so the other 2 seconds continued the fight without them. That is, until the artist's second was also knocked unconscious. And so the fight moved on to the principals, Cruikshank and Cavendish. Now, we don't know who landed the first blow, but we do know that both men were badly hurt. One report says that Cruikshank was cut over the eye, and that both of his seconds were knocked out cold. But another report claims that Cavendish was the one who was cut, that he fell down, and that this caused his cane to fall from his hand. Either way, the fight was soon broken up, and the men were pulled away from each other. The 2 seconds who had come to represent the artists in the fight were taken to a nearby tavern to recover, and eventually they were joined by their principals, who were both badly beaten. We don't know who won the fight, but we do know that both men were badly beaten. The real question is, why did they do it? Why put themselves through all of that pain and suffering just to defend their honor? Well, it's simple. because they had no other choice. In Victorian England, it was considered shameful to back down from a challenge, no matter how dangerous it was. In fact, it was expected that every member of the upper classes would always be ready to defend themselves against any accusation or insult, no matter how false or malicious. And so, if someone was accused of doing something wrong, they were expected to challenge the accuser to a duel. Of course, this meant that people were often fighting over things that weren't even worth fighting about. But that didn't matter. The point was to defend one's honor. As you can see, these kinds of duels were a regular occurrence during the Victorian era. And the worst part is that they were often fought over nothing. Just think about that for a moment. These men were willing to put their lives on the line over nothing. Now, imagine if someone challenged you to a fight because they thought you looked at them funny. Would you accept the challenge? Well, if you were a member of the Victorian elite, the answer would be yes, because to refuse would be to admit that you were afraid, and that was the worst thing of all. Today, we might think of these duels as being ridiculous and pointless, but to the men who fought them, they were very real and very serious events. In fact, many of these duels resulted in death or serious injury. So it wasn't always a good idea to accept a challenge, but these men were not backing down from a fight. They had to defend their honor no matter what, and so they fought, sometimes to the death. Now, what's interesting about this particular fight is that we don't know who won. Some reports say that Cruikshank was victorious, while others claim that it was Cavendish who came out on top. But really, does it matter? Both men were badly beaten, and that's all that's important. This fight was a true test of the Victorian Code of Honor, and it showed how far these men were willing to go to protect their reputations. They were willing to beat each other senseless, and that was the norm. A Victorian lady could host a dinner party for 40 guests. Could you? If you want to know how, then keep watching, because today we're talking about the Victorian elite and how they catered for huge dinner parties in their own homes. For our series on the Victorian elite, I am going through original sources from the era and making videos based on them to help bring history alive for you. And today's source is a book called The Etiquette of the Table, The Art of Serving and Entertaining at Home by Emily Post. It was originally published in 1922, so while it's not strictly Victorian, it does include a lot of information about Victorian etiquette that had been handed down since that time. So let's get into it. According to Emily Post, when planning a dinner party, one should first consider whether or not they have enough seating room. If you're seated at a small table with a crowd of people, it's not really going to be that comfortable, even if there are enough chairs. And a large group of people means more work for your servants. You can't expect them to do everything perfectly if you don't give them a chance. So what size party can you realistically throw in your home? Well, according to Mrs. Post, it depends on the length and width of the room. She says that you can seat 8 people around a square table in a room that's 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. And if the room is 12 feet by 10 feet, you can seat 10 people around a rectangular table. Now, she doesn't give us any more information after that, so I did a little bit of math and some geometry for you. If you double the length of the room, you can double the amount of people you can fit at the table. So in a room that's 24 feet long by 10 feet wide, you can seat 20 people. And in a room that's 12 feet long by 16 feet wide, you can seat 32 people. So, assuming you have a large dining room, let's say 18 by 24 feet, you could comfortably seat 32 people around a long, rectangular table. But you could also choose to have 2 tables facing each other that would seat 20 people, with the remaining 12 people seated at smaller side tables. This brings me to an interesting point. When arranging your furniture, if you have to move things around to accommodate your dinner party, don't just think about where the tables and chairs will go. Also consider where the other furniture is in the room. Mrs. Post says that when planning the placement of your furniture, you should think about how easy it is for your guests to circulate. Nothing will ruin the success of your party faster than having everyone feel like they have to walk around like they're playing musical chairs in order to have a conversation with someone new. When it comes to serving dinner to a large number of guests, you have 3 options. You can serve a multi-course meal family style. You can serve a single-course meal buffet style. Or you can serve a combination of the 2. For this example, we'll be doing a multi-course meal family style. Mrs. Post says that for every course of the meal, you will need an extra serving plate for each person at the table. So, in addition to your main dinner plate, each person will have a salad plate, a fish plate, a dessert plate, and then potentially more, depending on the number of courses. If you're serving soup, you may remember from my video on Victorian table settings that soup was always served in a separate bowl and then placed on top of the dinner plate. So in that case, each person would have an additional soup plate as well. In order to avoid confusion, each plate should be marked with the initial of the person it belongs to. And these plates aren't just for holding food, they're also used for serving. Mrs. Post says that in order for the serving to go smoothly, you need to have enough plates to replace the dirty ones without delay. At a large dinner party, this means you'll need a completely new set of plates for each guest. So if you're serving 32 people, you will need 160 plates. This is where having upper and lower servants is really helpful, because the lower servants can take the dirty dishes away, and the upper servants can continue to serve the clean plates. Speaking of servers, you'll also need to have enough waiters to serve each guest on either side. At a 32-person dinner party, you would need 16 waiters, 8 to serve from the right side and 8 to serve from the left. Mrs. Post has very strict rules about who should be seated next to whom. Family members should be seated together if possible, and women should be seated next to other women as much as possible. A man should only sit next to a woman if there is no other option. And no matter what, a woman should never be seated between 2 men. You'll also need to consider where to place the single people at the table. Ideally, single men should be seated at the end of the table, and single women should be seated on either side of the host and the hostess. The next thing you'll need to consider is the menu, and I have another video on Victorian menus that you can watch here. But basically, you should try to stick to foods that can be prepared in advance. Mrs. Post suggests serving something cold to start, such as a fruit salad or an egg dish. Then you can serve a hot soup or fish course. After that, you can serve the main dish, which should be roasted meat. And finally, you can serve dessert. In order to keep up with all of this, you'll need plenty of serving dishes. For a 32-person dinner party, you would need at least 16 serving platters, 1 for each of the 4 courses. And then you would also need extra bowls for the soup and possibly other sauces or side dishes. If you want to go all out, you can serve sorbet between each course. And this is actually something that Mrs. Post specifically calls attention to. She says that when serving sorbet, each guest needs a special bowl and spoon, and that the bowl should match the pattern of their individual dinner plates. Now, as far as drinks go, Mrs. Post recommends serving wine with the fish course, and with the main dish, you should also have plenty of non-alcoholic options available, such as water, lemonade, and coffee. Coffee is especially important because it helps to prolong the party. Mrs. Post says that serving coffee in the drawing room allows guests to linger longer after the meal. But speaking of lingering, how long can you expect your dinner party to last? According to Mrs. Post, a dinner party should last for at least 3 hours. She says that if the dinner is served promptly at 7 o'clock, it should continue until 10. At this time, the ladies will withdraw to the drawing room to have coffee, and the gentlemen will go to the smoking room to have cigars and liqueurs. After an hour, the whole company will reassemble, and the party will come to an end. That's a lot of work. But the good news is that if you follow all of these steps, you'll be able to impress your guests and have a wonderful time. As Mrs. Post says, a dinner party should be a time for enjoyment, not a source of fatigue or anxiety. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching.